So I've been on a bit of a Pokemon binge lately, and it got me thinking, what is the best way to play Game Boy Advance in the current year? In these dark, trying times of 2024. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty good selection of devices here to choose from, and I've just kind of accumulated these over the years. So I figured I'd go ahead and just discuss these with you guys real quick. Some pros, cons, pitfalls if you're just getting into this hobby now, and just some general thoughts about them. So yeah, let's get started. So I'll start with this. The best option is the one you already have. Okay? If you have a way to play these games and you're happy with it, there is no reason to FOMO into additional hardware. It's 2024. We have some excellent Game Boy Advance emulators available. I would consider Game Boy Advance to be a solved problem at this point. There's really nothing that you can do with original hardware that you can't also do with some form of emulation or some kind of device. So seriously, whatever you already have, just use it. Just play the damn games. Okay. That being said, the most obvious way to play GBA is to just get a GBA. It's not so straightforward anymore, though, unfortunately. There's a lot of models, there's mods out there, there's flash carts. So if you're just getting into this, what do you do? Alright, you'll notice I don't have any original hardware laid out here. I still have my original GBA and my GBA SP001 from my childhood. I've kind of just retired them. I took the batteries out and they're just resting now. They could definitely use some love, and eventually I'll get around to it. There's so many good options available that I haven't really felt the need to put any money into them or any time. But starting off, the original Game Boy Advance prices on this these days aren't too crazy, just because it's not generally a very desirable model. And the main reasons for that are going to be the non-backlit screen and the need of AA batteries, right? So kind of the GBASP just has kind of just completely taken over there. Now, of course, you can mod in an IPS screen, you can get rechargeable batteries, you can get flash cart. But for the expense, I don't think it's worth it, especially the screen mods. I have a lot of issues with them, and we're going to get to that later. Generally speaking, of all of the original hardware options, I'd say the original GBA is probably the weakest option. All right, so moving on to the Game Boy Advance SP, there are two options here. You have the 001 and then the AGS 101. So the main difference between the two, and really the only difference, is the screen, right? So the 001 has a frontlit screen, and the AGS 101 has a backlit screen. Obviously, the backlit screen is going to look significantly better. It's going to be brighter. It's going to have better colors. So generally speaking, the 001 has kind of fallen by the wayside. Prices are still crazy on it, but generally speaking, they are a little bit better than the AGS 101. And then the AGS 101 screen is just kind of beloved by the community. A lot of people would consider it to be the best way to play GBA and just Game Boy in general, just because of how good that screen is. So unfortunately, the real big problem with these devices is the price, right? So the AGS 101 specifically, but the 001 as well, prices are just absolutely insane right now. And I think they're just probably just going to keep getting worse. These are very popular devices on the internet. People it's kind of just the default recommendation for anything Game Boy related. Just get an SP. Everyone knows that the AGS 101 screen is better than the 001, so eBay sellers do price these accordingly, unfortunately. All right, and then we have the absolute scourge of reshells on the secondary market. It's gotten to the point where if you see a suspiciously good condition GBASP, I would avoid it, just because there's a very high chance that it's a reshell. Same goes for refurb devices. They are almost all reshells. It's a really big problem because a lot of sellers will not disclose that. And the issue I have with reshells is that they all suck, right? They feel cheap. They look cheap. The buttons, especially if the seller is or the person refurbing is foolish enough to throw out the original buttons and replace them, you are almost guaranteed to have a worse feeling console than it was when it had OEM parts. And it's a real big problem because you can't trust people when it comes to these things. A lot of people that have never handled an original device will buy a refurb and then they say, oh, it feels great, it feels fantastic, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. Like, I'm sorry. And you have no point of reference, so stop parroting this. Couple that with the very active repro market of Game Boy and Game Boy Advance carts, and it's just a disaster. So again, if you're seeing any kind of suspiciously good-looking GBA cart or GBA itself, there's a very, very high chance that it's a reshell and a repro, and just don't bother. Seriously, just save your money. The resellers are a really big part of this problem too. If you reshell the device, it's okay. Not really, to be honest, but it's okay. You need to disclose that you did that. All right, this is not a mint condition device. This is a reshelled device or a refurb, whatever you want to call it. But you can't call it a mint condition. You can't call it like new. You're just straight up scamming people at that point. Like, seriously, I would much rather have a scratched up original housing than whatever crap people are replacing it with. Of course, those won't sell on an eBay listing, so the market has kind of just forced the popularity of these things to skyrocket. And again, they are preying on people that have no point of reference and no context to what original hardware actually feels like. It's kind of just becoming a self-perpetuating problem. And the solution is to just stop giving it a market. Just stop buying these things. And then you have the screen replacements, which are equally as much of a problem in my opinion. They're almost all scaled, meaning that you're getting like a double or a triple scale. They look fine, but if I'm scaling the image anyway, I might as well just emulate, right? The whole point of using original hardware is getting that 1-to-1 pixel mapping of a like a 160p screen on the GBA that you can't get with newer devices and newer screens, right? So if you're gonna disregard that, you might as well just emulate. And to make things even worse, in order to actually scale that image, you need to have something called a frame buffer, meaning that the screen or the screen's hardware needs to keep at least one frame or one image in memory at all times in order to scale it, right? So meaning, and what that translates into is input lag. This is a verified problem. You're getting at least one frame of input lag even with the best IPS screens, and it's really just unavoidable. And yeah, I know that the newer screens have LCD filters to make them look more authentic, but again, at that point, just use an emulator. Like, who cares? If you're not getting an authentic experience anyway, right? You're using a repro shell, you're using an IPS screen, just use an emulator. You spent a lot of money to get a non-authentic experience. That's just a waste to me. You then have the issue of games with original hardware. So if you're trying to get any of the Pokemon carts loose or boxed, there is an incredibly high chance these days that you're getting a repro. And even when you do verify that the games are original, the insane prices just make it not worth it compared to just getting a flash card or honestly just getting a repro. I have no problem with repros existing or repros being made. That's totally fine. It's just, tell me that it's a repro. You need to disclose these things. If you're selling repros as original carts, you are just straight up scamming people. And if you buy an original cart that is a repro and you pay original cart prices, you are being scammed. If that happened to me, I think that would leave a very sour taste in my mouth, and it would just kind of destroy my enjoyment of playing any games. So just avoid this whole market, man. Just don't do it. If you really want a repro, go on AliExpress, get a repro. If you want a flash cart, just go buy a flash cart. If you want original hardware, I would highly recommend trying to buy it in person. And then, there's guides on how to verify these things, but if you're trying to buy original carts online, that's risky business these days. And speaking of flash carts, those also, kind of exist in tiers. At the very high end, you have carts that will replicate basically every single hardware function that you want. Especially, I think what people really care about is being able to flash the games to NOR, and that way you can use PalPark or just slot 2 games on DS in general. But those don't come cheap. And the really cheap ones, they'll work, but they won't have a real-time clock. They'll suck up your battery real quick. So a lot of times it's honestly just worth it to get the better option, but the better option these days tends to be either completely out of stock usually or very expensive. And they're expensive to the point where you really have to think about, is this worth the price? If you're only trying to play a couple of GBA games, maybe repros are actually the way to go. Just get a verified good one, one that will support whatever features that you want. For Pokemon, for example, you want something that will work with a real-time clock at the very minimum. And that's just kind of what the original hardware market is like right now. Because of the crazy COVID FOMO that was happening, prices have quadrupled, quintupled sometimes. It just doesn't look like it used to. You used to be able to just stumble upon AGS 101s, no problem, for like, $50, $40. That's just not the case anymore. So if you're just trying to play the games, I think that original hardware is maybe not worth it these days. If your prerogative is to collect and hoard as many Game Boys as you want, go ahead. You can deal with this market if you want. But if you're just trying to play some video games, just move on, man. It's not worth it. The headache and honestly the anxiety of making sure that whatever you're buying is authentic and it's not a reshell, it's not a repro. It's just such a headache. It just ruins my enjoyment. Like I just want to play the damn game. Come on. There are very significant pros to using original hardware though. You're gonna have full link cable support, so multiplayer won't be an issue. You're gonna have full GameCube link support, so you can go ahead and play those games if you want to transfer Pokemon to Coliseum or XD. That's going to be very easy, and just trading Pokemon in general is also going to be very easy. Provided that you have 2 expensive Game Boys and 2 expensive copies of the game, of course. The nostalgia aspect, for a lot of people, it doesn't feel right unless you're playing on an original Game Boy or an original SP, because that's what they did when they were kids. Thankfully, I've kind of been able to disconnect that nostalgia factor from my gaming experience, and I think I'm a lot better off for it, and that's what I would recommend to people getting into retro gaming these days. For some, it's just original hardware or bust, and I do respect that. I see where they're coming from. I would just feel scammed, honestly, if I was getting original hardware for the first time now. So just for new players, and they're just looking to get into this, I would just gloss completely over original hardware. Just don't even bother with this market unless you get really lucky or you find something in person. There is no reason to scour eBay for an old Game Boy when we have so many better options. I'm just going to quickly mention the Game Boy Micro. I love this thing. I love how it looks, but it's credit card sized, and the 2-inch screen is a little tiny for my aging eyes, unfortunately. The actual screen quality is somewhere between the 001 and then the AGS 101, so it's not like amazing or anything. It is a very pixel dense screen, so in person it does look really nice. It's 2 inches. I'd go cross-eyed staring at that thing for a long play session. Of course, they're stupid expensive because they didn't sell too well. So yeah. The next option we have for playing GBA games are the DS consoles. The first generation of these that will actually play physical GBA games are going to be the original DS and the DS Lite. They're often recommended for GBA, but they're plagued with problems that you really need to know about. The original DS is incredibly nostalgic to me. I saved up and I actually pre-ordered it. I got it at launch with the Super Mario 64 DS, and I was just blown away by it. It was my first device with a touchscreen, so I thought that was amazing. It was my first device with like networking and Wi-Fi. It really blew my mind back in the day. But that was like almost 20 years ago. These days, you're going to have a few issues, right? Probably the most obvious is going to be the hinge. They were not amazingly designed on these things. So if it was abused in the past, best case is going to be floppy, worst case is just going to be straight up bust. And then the screens on the original DS just straight up suck. Even by 2005 standards, people considered it to be worse than the AGS 001. Today especially, they're just really, really bad to look at. They almost look black and white with how desaturated they are. In terms of the actual backwards compatibility, only physical GBA cards work. So Game Boy and Game Boy Color are just complete no-goes here. They don't even fit. And yeah, I know you can run emulators through an R4, but again, if you're emulating, what's the point? Just get something better. And then the real big problem with the DS line when it comes to GBA is just the complete lack of multiplayer support. So you can't be trading Pokemon, you can't use GameCube link cables, so any features that are locked behind those things are just completely out. The actual scaling of GBA games on DSs aren't too bad though. It's definitely letterbox, but I think just in terms of scaling, it's a better attempt than what Nintendo did on the 3DS, and we'll get to that in a sec. The DS Lite is basically an original DS, but with worse build quality and better screens. This is my childhood DS Lite. Of course, the hinges are broken, and of course, the shoulder buttons I think are a little iffy. But it demonstrates the really big problem with the entire DS line that includes 3DSs. Rampant screen yellowing. And when I say yellowing, I'm not referring to the factory color calibration or screen temperature. I'm referring to the actual physical problem of the screens turning yellow over time. If you look around online, there's no good concrete explanation as to why this happens. It's most likely a combination of one or more of the plastic layers in the actual LCD just turning yellow with age, kind of like how old consoles will turn yellow. And then there's humidity, which will either accelerate the process, start it, or just make things worse. So you do need to keep that in mind when trying to buy one of these secondhand. It affects the entire DS line, including 3DSs, including IPS 3DSs. I'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a sec, but this is something you need to keep in the back of your head when it just comes to DSs in general. The main reason to go with an original DS for GBA though is going to be the slot 2 compatibility. So there's of course the PAL Park, which lets you transfer Pokemon from your GBA games to your DS games via slot 2. And then just off the top of my head, I know Mega Man ZX, Mega Man Battle Network 5, Lunar Nights, and a few others will all have features unlocked behind inserting a specific GBA game into slot 2. So that's going to be completely gone on DSi and 3DS. But if you're using an R4 to play the games, there's a lot of options these days to get these features back. So there's patched ROMs that will just have everything available for you. There's of course some action replay codes. Twilight Menu has a few options for that. So it's not like this content is gone forever or locked away from you if you can't insert a GBA game into slot 2. But the main thing that you're going to be missing out on is PAL Park, of course. I know the Twilight Menu devs have been looking into a way to implement this, but as of right now, there's nothing on that yet. You still have options when it comes to Pokemon migration, but I'm going to go ahead and discuss that a little later. So the first generation of DS consoles are a pretty great way to play GBA games, but you do have to be mindful of a few problems. Screen yellowing is going to be a big issue. A lot of people will just straight up not mention that on eBay listings. They won't even notice. If you're buying from a seller that is selling consoles in bulk or, quote, refurbished consoles, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get some piss yellow screens, unfortunately. This isn't as big of a problem with the original DS, but the DS Lite is also, unfortunately, a victim of the reshelling scourge. So just like with the GBASP, the DS Lite replacement shells suck to use, they feel like shit. Unfortunately, people seem to not care and they just keep reshelling these things. So if you're looking to get one of these things, you need to be careful of suspiciously good condition DS Lites. You need to be careful with listings that only have stock images. Definitely avoid refurbs if you can. And then of course make sure that there's pictures of the actual unit with the screen turned on. That way you can check if there's yellowing or not. It's hard to tell if a screen has yellowing or not through pics, but what you can do is download the image, dump it in GIMP or Photoshop, and then mess with the brightness and contrast to see if there's any differences. And ideally you have the screen displaying in just pure white so you can compare what the colors of the corners of the screen look like compared to the middle. Generally speaking, that's a pretty good way to see if there's at least any really bad yellowing on your screen. You also have the DSi consoles. There's the regular DSi and then the DSi XL. These are pretty decent ways to play Game Boy Advance games. You are limited to ROMs, and what you do is you just play them through a hypervisor called GBA Runner 2. These days the DSi has custom firmware support, so you don't need any special hardware like an R4 or whatever, but generally speaking, GBA Runner 2 has worse compatibility and accuracy compared to the 3DS Virtual Console solution and then just playing the carts on an original DS. In my experience with these things, the DSi consoles seem to have even worse yellowing than the DS Lites. The Japanese units seem to be especially affected. I guess the DSi and DSi XL sold better in Japan than they did in the US because eBay is just full of Japanese consoles. My personal theory is that just Japan is a very humid country, so these screens, I guess, degraded very fast over there. I have a few here that are pretty bad, like this DSi XL for example. I'm gonna have macro shots as well, but this is bad enough where I think you can just straight up see it on video. Unfortunately, there's just no fixing this. You can try and install a new screen, but that's a pain in the ass. And the aftermarket screens all have varying color temperatures, and some are better, some are worse. So if you can, try to get one with a good screen, but it's getting more and more difficult over time, unfortunately. A lot of people would say that the 3DS is the way to go now when it comes to backwards compatibility for DS and GBA. I kind of agree, but just like before, I'm going to be a Debbie Downer and there's issues that you need to watch out for. The most obvious issues with the 3DS is price. For whatever reason, the prices on these things are absolutely insane. Right now, they're going for like triple or even quadruple what they were going for pre-COVID. Doesn't really make sense to me. The 3DS sold very, very well, so you would think that supply is bigger than demand, but I guess not. The days of being able to snag a 3DS for less than $100 are gone, unfortunately. As I'm making this video, I would say if you're able to get a DS around, anything less than $250, I'd say you're doing pretty well. 3DS in general is a pretty good value, I would say, but there's some pretty significant problems that you need to know about. When it comes to GBA and DS games, scaling is a really, really big problem. Nintendo absolutely gimped the screen on this thing for the 3D gimmick that no one cared about, and they themselves just gave up on a little later. It's kind of been discussed to death already online, but I'll just quickly recap what the scaling is like on the 3DS. You either have stretched, or if you launch a game while holding select, you can have an integer scale. The highest you can go with integer scale is 1x, and it's absolutely tiny on every single 3DS console. The other option is just stretching the image out. It keeps the aspect ratio at least, but obviously you're going to have uneven pixels. So Nintendo's solution to interpolation was just smearing the entire screen in Vaseline. It's incredibly blurry. And I know people are going to scream at me for not mentioning this, so let's just very quickly talk about TWL patch. It's an attempt by the community to fix the scaling problems. It's an admirable attempt for sure, but it sucks. Literally every single option just looks worse than the stock Nintendo filtering. With how the scaling works, you'll notice that on all of the pages for it, there's no pictures or not very many good pictures, and there's a reason why. It's because they're all literally worse than the original. I'm not even joking. Every single one of these is worse than just Nintendo's default. Especially these linear this is the original. Yeah. So Nintendo, regular. Nintendo, and the TWL patch. Just absolutely useless. See here, Sonos Crisp. People like to compare this. This is the tweaked one too. Regular Nintendo, Crisp. Nintendo, Crisp. All that does is just makes the non-integer scale more obvious, and it adds a whole bunch of sharpening artifacts and ringing artifacts too. You can really see it on Mario. You can really see it on the little wrench there and on the Mario 64 screen. So this is the Nintendo scaling, and this is what they call Sonos Crisp, the one everyone recommends. And look at that. That's disgusting. That's absolutely horrid. Wow. Since I brought up IPS screens, the new 3DS models, there's a lottery. You either get a shitty TN panel or a shitty IPS panel. Don't go crazy about this because you can either get a top IPS, a bottom IPS, or both of them IPS. Honestly, the color calibration is garbage on all of them, so it's not worth the bellyache to hunt down an IPS model. And then these days, resellers are very aware of the IPS screen thing and have priced the IPS screens accordingly. So your chances of lucking out and getting an IPS screen is getting slimmer and slimmer, unfortunately. Again, it doesn't matter. If you cared about screen quality, you're not going to buy a 3DS. In terms of compatibility, the 3DS is able to use the GBA hardware a lot better than the DSi can. So I would consider it to be more or less one-to-one to an original GBA. It unfortunately lacks multiplayer support though, so you're not going to be trading Pokemon or linking up to GameCubes anytime soon on this thing. I mentioned this before, there's actually other ways that you can deal with this. Most annoying but also most legit way is to extract your save from the Virtual Console inject through God Mode 9. And you can use MGBA to do the actual multiplayer stuff, FTP the save back to your 3DS, and use God Mode 9 to re-inject that save back into your game. Absolutely a pain in the ass. The other way is to use a program called PKSM, and among the many things that it can do is take Pokemon out of any save that's on your 3DS, move it to a central bank, then you can move them up or down generations all the way up to the 3DS games, I believe. PKSM has other tools too, like being able to inject Wonder Cards and just events in general on the GBA game, so you don't need to use an action replay code or a patched ROM, so that's really convenient. So that's the main reason why I would deal with the horrible scaling of GBA and DS games on this thing. PKSM makes stuff like that so damn convenient, it's really hard to. They don't count as trades though, so it's not going to show up on your trainer card or anything. I think there's a way around that, but I'm not 100% sure. There's other tools that you can use as well, so there's the Circle Pad patched games that let you use analog control on DS games. That's super cool. In like Super Mario 64, for example, you can have like proper analog control on that. So if the convenience and all the tools that are available on the 3DS are important to you, and that's more important than scaling, definitely the 3DS is something to look at, with the caveats that I mentioned. And just a quick note on reshelling, there are housings available. They all suck for the 3DS, of course, but it doesn't seem to be as rampant of a problem on the 3DS compared to the DS or the GBA SP. As usual though, definitely avoid refurb listings and make sure that whatever you're buying, the pictures of the actual unit itself. The last thing I want to mention with the new 3DS line specifically is stripped screws. Take out the SD cards on these things, you have to remove 2 screws and then the entire back plate. For whatever reason, Nintendo chose to use really shitty screws, so they're actually pretty damn easy to strip. Just be on the lookout for that, for stripped screws, for backs that are cracked, just because it is a real big pain in the ass to remove the back plate once the screws are stripped. The 3DS is my pick of the bunch when it comes to original hardware. If you don't want your games to look shitty, move on to the emulator consoles. There's a whole industry around these things and there's just a million models to choose from, so I've kind of developed some exclusion criteria specifically when it comes to Game Boy Advance. So 640 by 480 screens are out. If I'm going to emulate, I need perfect scaling, and 640 by 480 is just not enough. It needs to have a strong enough CPU to be able to run MGBA at full speed. It needs to have an OS that supports a real-time clock, so that way you get full functionality on Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. Of course, the controls have to be good. So just before we get to the better devices, just a very quick note on the Anbernic RG300X. I know I'm breaking my 640 by 480 rule here, but if you integer scale GBA on this thing, it's actually 0.1 of an inch bigger than a Game Boy Advance micro screen. Obviously it looks like a Game Boy Micro, but built for adult hands. It's not necessarily strong enough to be able to run MGBA full speed for all games, but it does support the LibRetro port of GPSP. GPSP isn't trying to be cycle accurate like MGBA is. Compatibility is excellent. It's accurate enough that you won't really be able to tell the difference. It doesn't support shaders, but if you keep the aspect ratio and then fill the screen, it actually still looks better than the 3DS, which is just hilarious to me because that kind of scaling I would consider to be an affront to God. I guess these things didn't sell very well because they did price drop it quite significantly. I think you can get them for below 80 bucks now, especially when they're on sale. The actual build quality is pretty damn good, so 80 bucks seems like a pretty fair price to me. The controls are pretty typical Anbernic, so they feel fine, but you do have to open the device up and fix the D-pad. For whatever reason, Anbernic D-pads tend to have really disgustingly sensitive diagonals. So to fix that, you cover up bits of the actual button pads on the PCB itself. It takes some trial and error, but once you're able to figure it out, it works pretty damn well. So if this form factor is interesting to you, I would go ahead and grab it before the stock of it completely dries up. Pretty sure it's out of production at this point. Grabbed it on sale, and yeah, no regrets here. For the actual recommendations, I'm going to use the Retroid Pocket 3 Pro as an example of just the majority of Android devices out there these days. Generally speaking, these devices will have enough CPU power to run MGBA at full speed. RetroArch on Android has shader support, so you can take advantage of that and use one of those cool LCD shaders. And the screens have enough resolution for at least like a 2 or 3 or even 4 times integer scale of GBA. When you integer scale GBA on the Retroid Pocket 3 Pro, you do get black borders, but the actual size of the screen is more or less the same as a GBA SP. You can do all the multiplayer stuff with NetPlay on RetroArch, so that's really cool. And the Android version of Melon GBA will let you load a GBA ROM and save to be able to use on Palpark and whatnot. So overall, a pretty good pick to play GBA games on. And it would have been my choice of the bunch for emulators if this didn't exist. This is the Odroid Go Advance. It was one of the first of the kind of modern emulator handhelds, and the Anbernic RG351P is a clone of it. Of course, you're going to be asking, why the hell am I recommending these ancient devices when there's so many more powerful options these days? The screen fucking rocks. It's a 320 by 480 screen, so it sucks ass for everything, with the exception of Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. For GBA, it's a perfect 2x integer scale. I mean, just look at this, it's gorgeous. Going from the 3DS to one of these is almost like putting on prescription glasses for the first time. So alongside the perfect screen, you have a CPU that's good enough to run MGBA at full speed. There's a wide variety of Linux-based OSs that you can use on this thing. I think ArcOS is probably the most popular, meaning that you have a proper file system, you can set the real-time clock like you want. You need a little Wi-Fi dongle, but you can FTP saves over, so you don't even have to be taking out the SD card constantly. I actually have a little rsync script on the Odroid here that will go ahead and just back up all my saves to my desktop. Super convenient. Not all perfect. The Odroid Go Advance doesn't look like it's in production anymore. They're available all over. I think Ameridroid has them, and they're like $60, but the reason they're so cheap is because it's a DIY kit that comes in. But you have to build it yourself. If you enjoy that kind of thing, it's a really fun process, and just as a bonus, it supports Game Boy Pocket D-pads and buttons. Just in general, it's super easy to tinker on. I hated how the shoulder buttons felt, so I put little springs, little pen springs under them, and now they feel excellent. But I would be lying if I said that the controls feel anywhere near as nice as the Anbernic. That being said, you still have to fix the D-pad on the Anbernic though, so just keep that in mind. But the real issue that people have with these things are just the fact that they're basically unitaskers. While the screens are amazing for Game Boy Advance, they're pretty shit for everything else. If you really want to, you can run 240p games with an interpolation shader and just stretch them out, but it just doesn't look good. So if you really want one device that's going to play everything, this is not going to be an option for you. And that being said, some people would find the asking price a little too high for just the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. They go for around $100, I believe, and then a little less when they're on sale. So for that price or not much more, you can get a device that's going to play significantly more systems. So I definitely understand why some people have reservations with getting this compared to getting another device. For me though, the amazing screen is worth it. I really don't mind having a device that only plays a single console. If anything, it kind of feels more authentic to the original hardware. I have it so that RetroArch will just automatically boot up to the MGBA menu, so it's almost like using a flash card on a Game Boy Advance. Battery life is another reason why I love these things. You can get anywhere from 6 to 8 hours on a full charge. Probably more if you drop the brightness. The other nice thing is that they use generic batteries, so when they die, you can just go ahead and swap them out. Compare that to my 3DSs here that get a max of like 3 to 4 hours. And on my beloved old Hyrule new 3DS, the battery is starting to swell up a little bit, so it just will randomly die, unfortunately. Doesn't seem like Nintendo is making new batteries for these guys, so I'm probably going to just be stuck with 3 Pros, and it's going to suck. I know people are going to be bringing them up, so I'm going to just do a few last honorable mentions. The Revo K101, it's a GBA hardware clone. It sucks. 640 by 480 screen, doesn't have perfect compatibility. Scaling options suck, so it's kind of just the worst of everything put into one device. Really a cool novelty, but if you're going to get a novelty device, I think the RG300X is cooler. To me, they're not even worth considering for GBA. They've got crappy scaling and crappy emulation, so there's just no point when we have so many better options available these days. If you're buying either of these specifically for emulation in 2024, you're a fool. I'm sorry. I love them though, and they certainly have other uses, so I think my next video is going to be on the PSP and the Vita. God damn, that was long. So yeah, let me know what you use for GBA yourself, what your opinion is on all of these. Am I wrong? And please, if you know a way to deal with the plague of these yellowing screens, let me know. Hit like if you liked it, stay tuned for that PSP video, subscribe for more quality video game content, and yeah, see ya.